Welcome back, everyone. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. with a look at Axios AM, political reporter for Axios, Alexi McCammon. Alexi, great to have you with us. So what is the one big thing for today?
So it's 2019, and politics often seems more divisive than ever. But there was a recent project or experiment of sorts called America in One Room, which took place over a single weekend in Dallas. And it showed that when Democratic and Republican voters alike sat down face to face to discuss some of the most polarizing issues of their parties, whether that's on health care, immigration, the economy, even foreign policy, they often abandon that support for these polarizing issues when they discuss these things with people across the aisle. And that matters because as Congress is looking toward impeachment and Americans are facing another divisive election, this weekend experiment sort of shows a way for the politics of the future. It shows a way in which public opinion can form around policies when we're not sort of hunkering down in our echo chambers online or in the shows that we watch on TV, and we're instead given facts and guidance from policy experts and options to sort of discuss these things with people who might not agree with us otherwise.
All right, so how do we take this one room and then take the 300 million Americans and shove them into that one room?
So first we start by calling all of our friends.
Okay.
No, and that's the interesting thing, right? The reality is that this is not the way many Americans live their lives. We're all tantalized by social media. We're tempted by political hot takes. People gravitate toward these so-called alternative facts at different times. But the researchers and the people who led this, which was led by a group called Helena, are already thinking about ways to scale this. They're talking about doing it 4 times a year or once a quarter. And they are also talking about doing it online so that it's easier for people who can't necessarily get up and leave their jobs for 3 days to go talk about politics with strangers.
Talk about some of the more interesting things that you've seen in this experiment, some of the findings.
The most shocking thing to me was how Republican voters really softened their stance on various immigration policies. So before this weekend, they were very supportive of reducing the number of refugees who would be allowed to resettle in the U.S. But after a weekend of discussing and deliberating, that support dropped by 30 points. And that's shocking because we think that immigration is usually such a polarizing issue that both sides of the aisle try to use to their benefit. Obviously, there is legitimate concern for this issue in both parties. But that was something that really shocked me, given the way in which President Trump has tried to weaponize that issue. The other thing, considering what 2020 Democratic presidential candidates are proposing, is how Democratic voters are really not in love with the idea of a $15 minimum wage or a baby bonds program or even an expanded Medicare program when they sit down and read these policy papers and are guided by these experts and think through these ideas. And that sort of gives a lens into what this might mean in a larger context, both for the presidential election and congressional elections in 2020.
Let's switch gears for a moment and talk about one of the more polarizing issues taking place in Washington. Axios reporting that by seeking to impeach President Trump, now the Democrats could be out of options in the face of another scandal if, in fact, Trump is reelected. What is the risk, or what is the thinking behind that risk?
I feel like in the Trump era, we're always saying things are unprecedented, but this scenario that we're talking about in Axios AM today is truly uncharted territory. It's a look that we talked to various legal and political experts looking at whether and how President Trump survives impeachment politically, but is still potentially positioned to be reelected. That has never happened in U.S. history, where a president is impeached by the House and then gets reelected. Andrew Johnson was not nominated for a second term. Bill Clinton was in his second term. Richard Nixon obviously resigned during his second term. And it's not as if the House couldn't impeach President Trump again if he were reelected. But that just wouldn't look politically good for them, which is what a lot of experts have told us. The American people now sort of think that impeachment is a distraction, though the numbers are growing in support. I've talked to various swing voters around the country who think that House Democrats are distracted by impeachment and not necessarily focusing on the issues that they care about. So if House Democrats find themselves in a situation where they impeach President Trump, he's somehow reelected, and then they face the prospects of impeaching him again, that might just be politically untenable for a lot of folks.
So you wonder if he is reelected, will he go completely unchecked for 4 years?
We'll have to wait and see. Alexi McCammon live in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure. I'm going to be reading Axios AM in just a bit. And to all of our viewers out there, don't forget you too can sign up for that newsletter by going to signup.axios.com.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.